Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how I replaced a rusted trunk pan on my Honda S2000 Club Racer. When I purchased this car a year ago in Tennessee, I made the mistake of not inspecting the trunk for water damage. Months later, when I dug into the trunk to get a tow hook for a track day, I found that the spare tire kit was completely soaked with water. I stripped away the trunk carpeting to assess the damage and found that the bottom of the pan had some pretty serious rust. I did some research on S2KI and found several other people that had issues with water in the trunk, but few that had let it get this bad. I discovered that I had two options: cut out the rusted area and weld in some sheet metal, or replace the entire trunk pan with a new OEM pan. To my surprise, the new OEM pan only set me back $125. Once the pan arrived, I called some shops to get an estimate on how much labor it would be to have the trunk pan replaced, and the best quote I got was for $1,200. I wasn't too keen on paying $1,200 for labor, so I decided to go the adventurous route and do it myself. Before I get started, I want to be very clear that this is not a tutorial or a do-it-yourself guide by any means, but more of a documentation of my experience. Given that there was no documented procedure in the service manual or any tutorials on the internet, I was in uncharted territory, and frankly, I had little idea what I was doing. Hopefully you can learn from my mistakes. In order to get access to the trunk pan, I knew I had to remove the rear bumper, the exhaust, and the rear crash beam. Once I had access to the trunk pan, I tried to figure out how the trunk pan was actually attached to the body of the car. I used a heat gun and a wire wheel to remove the rubbery white seam sealer that covered the inside of the trunk pan, and the rubbery black undercoating that covered the bottom of the trunk pan. The heat helped loosen the coating and was easily removed with the wire wheel. After struggling for quite a bit, I found that there were a couple tack welds on the inside of the trunk pan in each corner. On the outside of the trunk pan, I found several spot welds lining each side of the trunk pan. They looked like circular dimples in the metal that were evenly spaced out. According to a vague post on S2KI, I was supposed to drill out these spot welds in order to release the trunk pan from the frame. So I used a drill bit and drilled out the spot welds. After doing this for two sides of the trunk pan, I realized that I was probably doing something wrong since I was removing material from the frame. This is where I made my first mistake. I put my work on pause, went on YouTube, and learned that spot welds are meant to be drilled out with a special drill bit. I also learned that these spot welds were done on the assembly line, so there was no way that I would be able to reproduce them now since the car was fully assembled. So technically it didn't really matter that I was drilling through the frame, but I could have gotten the job done a little more gracefully. After acquiring the correct spot weld drill bit, I continued to drill out the two remaining sides. I used a hammer and a punch to create dimples on the spot welds for the drill bit guide to sit in. Then I simply drilled until the drill bit made it through the trunk pan metal layer. I didn't film this, but in order to drill out the spot welds for the forwardmost trunk pan side, I had to remove the sway bar bushings. Once all the spot welds were drilled out, I had to use an angle grinder to remove the tack welds from inside the trunk pan. Finally, after several hours, I removed the rusted trunk pan from the car. Given that spot welding was not an option for reassembly, I devised a plan to weld the trunk pan to the frame from the inside. I found a mobile welder on Craigslist who came to my house, and $200 later, the trunk pan was welded to the frame. It wasn't the most beautiful job, but it was good enough for me. Now, all that was left was to protect the trunk from future rust issues. The first thing I did was install the two new OEM trunk pan drain plugs. Next, I did my best to restore the OEM rubber underbody coating. I sprayed 2 cans of 3M professional grade rubberized undercoating on the underside of the trunk pan where it met the frame. The spray came out really thick and left a nice textured black coat on the car. These cans set me back $18 each. While doing research about the trunk rust issue, I learned about a product called POR 15, also known as paint over rust. After several recommendations, including Billman's, I knew this was the stuff that I was going to use to coat the inside of the trunk pan. I ended up using the POR 15 starter kit for about $20, which includes some paint, a brush, and preparation materials. I followed the instructions and prepared the work area before applying 3 coats of POR 15. It was extremely easy to apply with the brush and cured into an extremely hard, gloss black protective coating. The last thing I had to do was restore the OEM seam sealer on the inside of the trunk pan, where the trunk pan meets the frame of the car. I picked up some seam sealer on Amazon for about $14 and got a caulking gun to apply it. After pushing out the seam sealer with the caulking gun, I used my fingers to spread the sealer evenly along the gap between the trunk pan and the frame rail. My advice is to use a seam sealer sparingly and keep the layer as thin as possible to ensure that it will cure fast and harden. I had applied too much seam sealer in a few places, causing it to sag and remain soft. Luckily, it's pretty easy to remove if it doesn't cure. Once the seam sealer had cured, the only thing left for me to do was put everything back together. And that is how I replaced my trunk pan. I made a few mistakes along the way, but I saved myself hundreds of dollars and learned more about cars and the S2000 in the process, so it's a win in my book. If you have any recommendations for ways that I could have improved this job, please leave them down below in the comments for others to learn from.